This is my 2023 Big Picture Address to the Highland Group. It's an annual address I make on the first Friday in December. It's one of the very few speeches I make each year. And I try to summarize world events from my specialty, which is explaining why and how the deep state deceives us, what conspiracy is all about, how the CIA both does good things and bad things, that there's a black side to the CIA and a white side, there's a black side, a dark side to the FBI, there's a dark side to the DEA and a good side. And this is something that you need to understand. It's very, very complex. We in the conservative movement often try to simplify it too much. We want it just black and white, but there's a lot of shades of gray. For example, prior to this speech, I had a question relayed to me through Paul at K-Talk Radio before I usually give my Friday World Affairs brief on the radio there, and he said, you know, he has a very important question about the globalists. And he said, well, I don't understand why the globalists are involved in so much in building, buying up houses and other things and doing big things, and yet there's a war planned and there's other types of things. And how do I explain that they are, don't they know that it's futile to do all of these big building projects? And I said, well, you know, the globalists are not all on the same page. There are globalists that are simply yes men to the establishment. There are globalists who are higher up, who are actually have spiritual communication with Satan, who directs their moves, but those are very, very few, and we don't even know who they are. But there are people, very few of the globalists actually know that this war is coming. Even Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum doesn't know. You've got all of these ideologues within the globalist movement who talk about an AI robotic society, how you're going to not own anything and be very happy, how you're all going to drive electric cars. Well, they don't know that when an EMP strike comes and that's preceding this nuclear war, anyone with an electric car is going to be dead in the water. Anyone with cryptocurrency is going to lose everything. There's going to be no electricity and therefore no internet, and it's going to be down for at least a year, because we don't stockpile any of the huge truck-sized transformers that take the thousands of volts in cross-country transmission lines and transform them down to 240 and 120 volts for usability in the house. Even the globalists are going to need cash, so forget about central bank digital currency taking away cash. Even the globalists will need cash when this EMP strike comes. And so there are a lot of things that people don't understand and they get caught up in, and it's my job in the World Affairs Brief, which I edit and publish every Friday, to try to sort through these things. And for the first time in many years, I've published today's World Affairs Brief on a condensed version of this speech. I'm going to go for about an hour and a half, and I've condensed it down into today's World Affairs Brief. And if you're not familiar with the World Affairs Brief, you can go to worldaffairsbrief.com and click on Request a Sample on the left-hand side, and you'll get this current brief for reference if you want a copy of what I'm going to say today. And it tells you how to subscribe. There's a modest fee. I know you're not used to paying for something on the internet, but I think you get real value when you pay for something, and I do have a loyal subscribership. It's about $1 a month. But I try to tell people the truth, and that's what I'm going to try to do tonight on some very controversial subjects. We're going to cover, of course, the war in Israel and the war in Ukraine. We're going to cover the status of Russian-Chinese military preparedness versus the U.S. and how we're getting behind, at least for China, in relationship to China. Update on timing of when this world war is coming. I'm sure you're all interested in that. And a summary of the rapid deconstruction of America. Politically, of course, we know about the election fraud, even though every time you hear about Trump being indicted in various things, they say, you know, and he claimed the lie that there was election fraud, which has been proven to be false. Well, it hasn't been proven to be false. They just never used the right information, and neither did Trump, because his attorney, Rudolph Giuliani, is deep state. How do I know he's deep state? Because he was directly involved in covering up for the 9/11 catastrophe, which was a deep state operation. He had his emergency center in Building 7, which was pulled, that is, controlled demolition. He was warned in advance, got all his staff out, got everybody out of the building, and did not warn the firefighters climbing up the World Trade. And this is the mayor of the city. Did not warn the firefighters, and many of them who found out about this hate him to this day. But he was a drunk on job during most of his time with Donald Trump, and he sabotaged the legal cases against them. He never provided any evidence quantitatively of voter fraud, only hypotheticals and glitches in that. And so the judges would easily be able to say, well, you haven't proven that it made any difference in the election. If he'd read the World Affairs Brief, he would see what I put out, which was the hacked election data from Edison Research, which is I'll call it a deep state organization owned by a parent company in Spain that provides all the election results from all the states to the news media. So when you see those statistics in the news media election, they come from Edison Research. And somebody hacked into the room and they found out how many hundreds of thousands of votes had been flipped from Biden or Trump to Biden, and how many had been disappeared that came in for Donald Trump and they didn't get registered. How many were, there's all kinds of irregularity. It was all there in black and white. And it was very much suppressed, of course, by the mainstream media, but Donald Trump didn't pick up on it. Because Donald Trump, even though he has good instincts about making America great, doesn't do any homework. He lives by briefings and Fox News on television, which you won't hear anything about conspiracy. And so Donald Trump came to the presidency without any experience as a conservative, never been a conservative, friends of Hillary Clinton and many other mainstream people. But being a good populist, he understood what Americans wanted, what the problems were, and then he came up with this Make America Great. The trouble is, he didn't know how to argue. He didn't have any background in conspiracy, so he couldn't tell who was deep state and who wasn't deep state. And so who did he put on the Supreme Court? Brett Kavanaugh, who's deep state. Now, he's a conservative jurist, but he was second in command to Ken Starr in the Vince Foster cover-up. Vince Foster was the attorney for the Clintons, and he was killed by the deep state because he was getting wobbly legs. He was going to go before Congress, and they were afraid he was going to spill the beans about their secret bank accounts in Switzerland. So they had him killed, and they faked the suicide. Well, Brett Kavanaugh was the one who was going after the one witness who said Vince Foster's car was not in the parking lot of Fort Marcy, so he couldn't have driven there to commit suicide. His body was moved there after being murdered. It was Brett Kavanaugh's job to suppress that witness and make sure that he was intimidated all the time. Now he's on the Supreme Court, and so like John Roberts, whenever there's a crucial case, not every case, they're allowed to vote conservative occasionally, but when there's a crucial case that the deep state wants changed, they change their vote and vote with the left. So this is a very complex situation. Politically, it's my estimation we will never win another election for a conservative nationally. You might at local levels, but they won't allow it nationally, and let alone Donald Trump. It'll never happen. Now, I know you don't want to hear that, but when you see it happen, you'll know that it's because of election fraud, and it's now so inculcated in the computers thing because it's in the, sure, you have vote flipping on computers that still happens, and they claim it's a glitch, and it happened in the last election. But the major flips happen at the tabulation computer level. Edison Research, that's where it comes in, and they tabulate and they feed it to the nation. That's where it's happening. So it isn't dominion in and of itself. And so I don't say that. You get sued like Mike Lindell did for all his worth because you can't prove. And it isn't China. There's a lot of disinformation that was put out about election fraud, that it was hacked by China, and it wasn't true. The deep state was simply covering for their election fraud by pointing the finger at China. Now we're in an unstoppable onslaught against all our family values in the West, not only because of evil external conspiracies, but the headlong rush of a majority in the West to embrace the worst of worldly immoral influences, social media bad thinking, and distorted woke values. And I'll cover that at the end when I talk about foreign policy first. Let's talk about the war in Israel. Now, there are no good actors in here, except about half of the population of Gaza who are relatively innocent. The ones that voted for Hamas are not innocent. And about half the Israelis, which are pretty decent. But they're very secular. There are very few religious Jews, and the religious Jews are pretty radical and narrow in their thinking. When I was in Israel several times, I did meet some really good conservative Jews who did homeschooling and had their own medical care and had a free market system of living in their own. It wasn't really a commune like the kibbutzim, but really good people. But they're a very small minority. When you go to Israel, it's like a typical Middle Eastern city. You're honking horns, cursing out the windows, shaking your fist at people. It's anything but a religious wonderland. But you see, the Israeli government is run by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a Kissinger protege. Henry Kissinger, the arch globalist who has ruled this world for so many years, well, at least in the public eye. I don't know if he was really one of the top people in secret that we don't know and never will know who they are. But Henry Kissinger just died at the age of 100, and all the world is lauding him as the great statesman of our time. I estimate he's the worst statesman of our time. And Peter Schweitzer in Breitbart News gave a pretty good documentation of the giveaways of Henry Kissinger, but he missed a lot of them, including what he did at the Paris peace talks, where he actually gave away Vietnam to the communists, even though the Vietnamese came to the peace talks beaten because of the bombing campaign. They came ready to make concessions, and he gave it all away and just said secretly, and this has rarely been ever discussed, he said, but give us 3 years before you take back South Vietnam. And it was almost 3 years to the month when they did reinvade. And of course, it had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, but he ousted Taiwan from the UN and agreed that China could take its place and have a seat on the Security Council. Now, why would even a globalist give China, a sworn enemy, a seat on the Security Council with veto power? I mean, it's one thing to give Taiwan's seat to Red China, but to give them a seat on the Security Council, this was just beyond the board. And of course, then they gave them most favored nation trading status, which allowed them to enter into Western trade and, steal so much technology as a condition of doing business with Red China. And that was implemented, by the way, by Newt Gingrich, the Republican who was going to have a contract with America, that many of us who remember say it was a contract on America, because his first thing he did was get the Republicans to vote for WTO membership, World Trade Organization membership for Red China. That wasn't on his list. So it's very, very bad. It's going to get worse. But there are no good actors in the Middle East. And as I say, Henry Kissinger and Associates paid for Benjamin Netanyahu's education in the United States. They gave him his first job on Wall Street. They set him up in politics in Israel by allowing him as a young graduate from the United States, that's where he learned English, to go into Israel and hold an anti-terrorism conference of which all the rich and the famous attended. Now, anybody that can do that in Israel is a sudden political hero. That's how he got his start. But his career has been one of total corruption since then, taking money, illegal political donations from many people. And he's been on the docket for corruption for over 10 years and evaded prosecution. And part of the motivation for this war, I believe, is when you're a wartime president, you continue to get immunity from prosecution. But that's not the only thing. There is a real deep state in Israel. In fact, the Israeli deep state is very much an integral part of the United States deep state. They do most of the international political assassinations for our own dark side of the CIA. They did not, however, despite a lot of propaganda on the web, do 9/11. They had an observational role, and they had a team up there on a hill watching and cheering for the collapse of the towers. But this was much bigger than Israel, and it was our own deep state who hired the Arabs from Saudi Arabia and hired them to play like they were the terrorists. They did not actually fly the airplanes that flew into the World Trade Center. The U.S. had the technology of uninterruptible autopilots were on these airlines, and they're still on the airlines, that they can actually take control remotely of those airlines, and the pilot can't do anything about it. They're fly-by-wire. You can do this only with fly-by-wire aircraft, which means it's computer-controlled. You move the stick, and it tells the computer where to move the ailerons and elevators by hydraulics. But uninterruptible autopilot is a separate autopilot from the real autopilot that the pilots control. And when you remotely control that, pre-program it with the navigation, you can fly it anywhere in the world and punch it into a tower with precision. Because these people couldn't fly airplanes. I can tell you as a fighter pilot, you've trained on a Cessna, you wouldn't even know how to turn off the autopilot in a pilot. You wouldn't know how to reprogram the navigation computer. And believe me, it's not very easy to find your way back halfway across the country to New York and hit a building straight on. You just can't do it, especially after learning to fly on a Cessna and failing to fly on a Cessna aircraft. So those pilots are there for the show and the box cutters for the show. There's a lot of things that I won't go into. On my website, World Affairs Brief, there's a major piece on the various conspiracies that are true in life, and one of those is the 9/11 update. Goes through all of the evidence that this was a deep state operation from beginning to end, including the loading of the buildings with explosives. But going back to the Middle East war, this was Israel's 9/11. And in more ways than one, that's true. Now, they didn't hire the terrorists to attack Israel, but they let it happen. And I've documented this for months now in the World Affairs Brief, and the evidence keeps rolling in. The New York Times just published a piece, and they're normally extremely pro-Israel. But they got this piece of leaked information out of Israel from someone within the bowels of Israel, showing multi-pages of documentations of how the Israeli intelligence service had the complete attack plan of Hamas a year in advance, and they dismissed it as aspirational, a wish list of what they could do when they can't possibly pull this off. Oh, come on, I'm not buying that. Because Israel, rather than prepare for it, rather than do anything, they pulled out the Gaza battalion out of southern Israel, at least 80% of it, and moved it to the West Bank. So they were 7 hours away from being able to respond to the Hamas attack. That's a stand down. And then there were private surveillance experts listening in with equipment provided by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, listening in on telephone and radio and other conversations of the Hamas, and was feeding this alarming information about the incoming attack. And finally, the IDF leaders, very high up, said, shut him down, pull his equipment, take it away from him, and don't let him talk to us anymore. So this was a stand down to let this attack happen. Now, you ask yourself, why would they do this? I hypothesize because they've been training to attack Iran for years, and they've been provoking Iran for years. Now, Iran is not a good nation. The Ayatollahs of Iran are radical Islamists, and they oppress their people just like other radical, tyrannical people do. But they also know that they're in the crosshairs of the globalists. Why do the globalists want Iran eliminated? Because they're the only Muslim country that is self-sufficient in weaponry without the help of the East or the West. Now, they do get some technical assistance from the East, but they're not dependent on it. They have their own factories. They produce drones for Russia, in fact, better drones than what Russia can fly. And so the globalists can't tolerate that. They want Muslim nations to be puppet nations that they can control. And Iran has to go. And so the Israelis have been attacking Iranian bases in Syria for over 2 years, trying to provoke them into a response so they could actually attack them and create a larger war. And that hasn't happened. Iran isn't taking the bait. The U.S. has started, in response to this Israeli-Hamas war, started to attack Iranian bases in Syria. And Iran has still not taken the bait, even though Iran's militia in Iraq have attacked U.S. forces in northern Syria. Now, what are the U.S. forces doing in northern Syria? They have no business doing there. They haven't been invited in by the Syrian government. The Syrian government didn't do anything to the United States to justify the invasion. But Syria has been the excuse for the U.S. to meddle in the Middle East for now several years. It all started with the Obama administration, a bombing of Libya and Tunisia. And they did that claiming that it was, somehow a defensive move, but they went and bombed the heck out of them and created a wave of Islamic hatred for the West. And then they recruited those Islamists, those radical Islamists, and moved them into Syria and claimed that there was a civil war against Bashar al-Assad. Now, Hafez al-Assad, his father, was a radical, extreme Arab leader who actually made deals with the CIA and provided torture for the CIA. But he was not a good guy, and there's a deep state in Syria as well. But Bashar al-Assad is a UK-educated ophthalmologist and with fairly refined values and married to a British woman. He's not the same as his father. Now, he still has a deep state to deal with in Syria. But he wasn't guilty of anything that required a civil war, except that the U.S. engendered it. In fact, the U.S. deep state created all of our major terrorist organizations. They took the Mujahideen, which they financed in the CIA against the Russians in Afghanistan, turned them into al-Qaeda. And then they took about 50% of the Arab terrorists that they moved into Syria for this. It took about half of them and created ISIS out of that. They gave them priority of weapons and sent them on a rampage into Iraq and into Europe to create terrorist things. And Dilyana Detancheva, a Romanian journalist, went undercover and found in the stockpiles and storage rooms of ISIS, they found a lot of U.S. supplied weapons and even paperwork showing how it had been laundered from the U.S. The deep state of our own government created ISIS. And that's why, when they were so-called fighting ISIS, they never did attack any of the oil convoys going into Turkey. ISIS was selling all of the oil from Syria after they had captured northern Syria into Turkey, and Turkey was selling it to Israel. This was ISIS oil. Until the Russians decided to bomb the oil convoys stacked up at the border waiting to go into Turkey. And then they said to the U.S., this is what you should be doing if you're really fighting ISIS. And so the U.S. did do one bombing raid against another oil lineup at the border with Turkey, but they threw down leaflets from the helicopter before and warned them to get out of their trucks so they didn't kill any of the drivers. They rescued ISIS leaders out of the Battle of Mosul. And it's mostly the Iraqis that were fighting ISIS and killing them. And who was leading the Iraqis? Who was financing and arming them? General Soleimani from Iran. American intelligence lied to President Trump when they told him that General Soleimani was the biggest sponsor of terror in the world and that we have to kill him. And Trump did. But he wasn't the biggest sponsor. He was the biggest sponsor of Iraqi militia fighting U.S.-backed terror, i.e. ISIS. And that's why U.S. intelligence wanted him killed. And Trump fell into it because he didn't know conspiracy. He doesn't know who's deep state and who isn't. He doesn't do his homework. Now, I don't fault the fact he has good intentions. He wants to drain the swamp, but how can you drain the swamp if you can't tell a swamp creature from a bad guy or a good guy? And so the Middle East war is really a mess. Hamas is not a good organization. I've been to Israel many times, and I can tell you that there is a difference between the Israeli people and the Arab people. The Arab children are taught and propagandized constantly to hate Israel. And of course, the Arabs justify that by saying the Israelis took our land during the War of Independence in 1947 and 48. Well, in fact, and they say the Israelis drove out the Arabs, but in fact it wasn't. It was the Arab leaders who drove out their Arab people and said, after we kill the Israelis and drive them to the sea, then you can come back with your land. Well, the Israelis won the war, and so the Israelis couldn't let the Arabs back in because they were going to establish a Jewish state, and they knew that they had, being a raw democracy, in fact it was a socialist Marxist state. The original Jews who started the state of Israel were Marxists, a lot of them from Russia. And so it was an extreme socialist state, no free market at all. And with that kind of raw democracy, with whoever controls the vote gets all the benefits in a socialist state, they couldn't allow the Arabs back in or they would outvote them. And they didn't. And they left, there were enough Arabs still in that they do have a living arrangement where the Arabs can live in relative peace in Israel. But the radicals, of course, have been put out into Gaza, in which has become a hotbed of terrorism. And it's got 2.3 million people in Gaza. It's a built-up concrete jungle. It's completely dependent on Israel for its water supply and for its electricity supply. And Israel has a customs union that's supposed to check everything that comes in there, but they're still able to smuggle in rockets, explosives, grenades, you name it, all kinds of weapons still get into Gaza. And a lot of that used to come through the Rafah crossing in Egypt until Israel put pressure on Egypt to stop that. But you can tell by all the rockets, and a lot of those are homemade rockets. They cut up water pipe and they turn them into rockets, but you still have to import rocket fuel. They can't make that locally. So it's a real mess. And as I say, the hatred is so strong now between the Arabs and the Israelis. You can't give them a two-state solution. A two-state solution would only say, we're independent now, we have free commerce with the world. They would arm like a bandit, and like Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is ensconced within a sovereign state, they're getting tremendous weaponry from Iran. And so are the Houthis rebels in Yemen. And so that's where most of the firepower is coming from against Israel. But you see, Israel's not a good actor either. They're not represented. They're treasonous. The leaders in Israel are treasonous to their own people. They are responsible for allowing Hamas to come in and kill 1,400 Israelis, including soldiers and men, women, and children, and collecting those hostages. Israel has dealt with hostages for years with the Arabs, and it's usually a very lopsided relationship. Hamas gets some hostages, even for one soldier. Israel has sometimes given up over 100 Palestinian terrorists to get one soldier back. And that's really a bad policy. As much as you hate to see a soldier captured, when they know that they can put that kind of leverage on you, it's really a sad day. And you never get rid of the hostage situation. And that's why Hamas took so many hostages. They knew they could control the agenda of the war by bargaining hostage. And that's what's happened in the past 2 weeks, when they've had hostage negotiations, and they've released 200 approximately Palestinian, and most of them are teenagers, rock throwers, and women who have committed terrorist acts or been caught trying to plan them. They haven't let any of the hardened terrorists go yet, but Hamas is still angling for that. Now, the truce is off now, and the missiles are flying again, so that phase of the war is over. Israel has gone through most of northern Gaza, where Hamas had most of its military and tunnel operations based. But Hamas has over 400 kilometers of tunnels underneath the ground. I don't know where they put all the dirt. With U.S. satellite, intelligence being able to see, 400 kilometers of tunnels has got a lot of dirt to remove. It's not like the Great Escape where you can spread it around in the garden. But in any case, Israel's slowly and methodically going through and finding the tunnels and eliminating them. So, but they've claimed that they've vowed they're going to get Hamas and completely eliminate it, and that's not possible within 2.3 million people. Even if you have 50,000 people, that's a pittance compared to all the populace, especially with all the hiding places you have. And so Hamas has just continued to move south to get away from the Israeli troops with their tunnel system, which goes all the way down to Egypt, and they have tunnel systems going up into Egypt and the border. So I think it's futile that Hamas is ever going to be able to be eliminated by Israeli military capacity. And Israel, of course, is very sensitive to casualties. The Jewish people have this mixed philosophy theologically about whether there's a resurrection or not, and there's just a lot of different interpretations. So there's a lot of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth when people die. They don't have a Christian perspective of the afterlife. Some of them do, but most of them don't. And so it's a real problem for them when there is in death. And so politically speaking, the Israeli government has to really make sure that they keep the death count, and that's why they give so much to get hostages back. But under those constraints, I don't think you're ever going to win this war. In fact, I don't think there's ever going to be peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. Now, in terms of the Christian perspective, a lot of Christians, including LDS and evangelicals, believe that, the biblical promises about Israel being restored to the house of Israel. And I think that's actually already been fulfilled, not because Israelis have become unnecessarily righteous people or deserve it, but as the Lord often does, because of the promises to the Father, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When he makes promises to the fathers anciently, he fulfills them, even though it's not a good outlook. In fact, when the second coming comes, the Jews will still not recognize the Savior and say to him, "What are the marks in these hands and your feet?" They're still not Christian. And only a few will be saved after the Battle of Armageddon and the 3-year destruction that will come upon Jerusalem. But going back to the current war, the Middle East war, wider Middle East war with Iran has not materialized, and Hezbollah has only done sporadic attacks against Israel. They have been slowly increasing. But there is fear that there's going to be a wider uprising or intifada in Israel with the West Bank. Now, the West Bank is a much larger area than Gaza, has a lot more Arabs in it, and they have Jewish settlers with a grudge match because Jewish settlers have settled on Arab land and built new, Israel really is crowded and has run out of place to put new Jewish settlers, and so they've taken to Arab land, and that's caused a lot of consternation there. But U.S. and Israel continued to attack Syria, and the U.S. is doing it too out of the USS Ford with naval air power. And the initial reason for hitting Iranian bases in Syria was to provoke an Iranian response. Every time that hasn't worked. However, the U.S. has not set up a blockade to stop Iran from continuing to resupply militarily Hezbollah in Lebanon, nor the Houthis in Yemen. They have cut down, the Israelis themselves have made sure there's nothing more coming into Gaza. Now, Israel continues something that's very problematic. They continue to collaborate with Qatar, which is another Middle East kingdom there in the Persian Gulf. And you'd pronounce it Qatar, but it's Qatar. And the International Committee and Israel have been pressuring Qatar to continue to finance and pay millions of dollars to Hamas. Now you wonder, how can you do that? How can you vow to eliminate Hamas and then pressure Qatar to give more millions to them, as well as fuel to run their generators? But that's what they're doing. And it's also interesting, most Americans don't realize that the leaders of Hamas live in luxury in Qatar in 5-star hotels, very near to a big U.S. air base, and the U.S. air base doesn't do anything to capture and turn over these terrorist leaders to the International Tribunal for Human Rights, which they're in violation, being terrorists of human rights. Of course, the Israelis violate human rights too. There's no good guys in this fight. But this is a real conundrum here about Israel financing Hamas through Qatar. So the only way that this war is going to get wider, in my opinion, is if Israel decides, and I think it was probable that one of the reasons for allowing this Hamas attack was to create such a very tyrannical situation that the international community would feel Israel is justified in going after Iran for arming all of these countries and arming Hamas. But the only way that's going to happen now if Israel attacks Iran anyway, which still could happen. But one of the purposes of war is also a globalist purpose. Remember, Netanyahu is a globalist. He's a protege of Henry Kissinger. So he isn't really running. I mean, there's all kinds of globalist agendas going on in Israel. They have surveillance of their people, like is typical of any deep state type of thing. And so there's a real globalist agenda in there in Israel. And it isn't surprising that the globalists are calling for the United States to take on thousands and thousands of Palestinian refugees from Gaza. And that's the worst thing you want to bring into the United States. And when I talk about the immigration thing, you'll see that the Biden administration is bringing in the dregs of the earth from Africa and from other countries, supposedly dreaming of the American dream. And that dream is shattered. They go to Chicago and they realize, you're not allowing me to do anything. I can't start a business. I can't do anything. I'm stuck in a refugee camp. And this is a recipe for BLM and Antifa to get a hold of these people and radicalize them. And that's why we could have a lot of terrorism for this. But that's one of the main things, main purposes for the war on terror spawned by 9/11 was why invade Iraq, for example? Why invade Afghanistan? For 20 years, we spent $6 trillion in Afghanistan. What for? Because they were hiding Osama bin Laden? Well, I tell you, Osama bin Laden was already dead. Remember when Obama supposedly sent the SEAL Team 6 out to get Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan? That wasn't Osama bin Laden. He died 2 years earlier of kidney failure. He worked for the CIA. He didn't do 9/11. They had several Osama bin Laden lookalikes that did the videos and things admitting to doing with 9/11, but it wasn't Osama bin Laden because it was a deep state operation from beginning in, housed right here in the United States. But they killed a lookalike in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and that's why they dumped his body in the ocean, so there'd be no DNA forensics, and they falsified that too. But part of the reason for all of this war on terror was to create so much chaos in Syria and in the Middle East that would create a wave of refugees to invade Europe, and it's happened. And now you have all these ghettos in Europe and all of these riots and these pro-Palestinian parades and violence going on in Europe, and that's part of the conflict agenda that the globalists are so interested in. And they're importing them by the millions into the United States. We imported in August over 300,000 illegals the size of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So every month we're bringing in another American city's worth of illegals and they're problem people. They're not like it used to be where you had a lot of good, hardworking Mexicans come in these people are prone to violence and these people are very disgruntled. And they generally hate this country after their disappointment in getting here, and it's a recipe for future terror. Well, let's move on to the war in Ukraine. The Ukraine is the most contentious issue between Republicans and Democrats in this country because Republicans have been fooled and conservatives have been fooled by a very disconcerting propaganda campaign done by Russia itself and by a lot of unknowing, silly people who don't know conspiracy history. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The fighting in Ukraine has weakened Russia's conventional military and significantly exposed many of Russia's chronic conventional weaknesses to Western military intelligence. Scott Ritter, who turned out a former Marine and inspector of weapons inspector, turned out to be a shill for Russia, saying that Russia was just going to obliterate the United States because of its artillery, biggest artillery forces in the world, and that just didn't happen in Ukraine. Yes, they have a lot of artillery damage, but the U.S. has developed, of course, anti-artillery weapons, which can track artilleries coming in and send another round out there and kill the artillery that launched the rounds. And so artillery isn't what it's been before, although it's still very effective in terms of killing a lot of people. But only Russia's advanced missile technology has proven itself in this war and has been very effective. And they haven't used any of their long-range ICBMs or followed through with their periodic threats to retaliate with nuclear weapons against the West. And why not? Because they can't occupy after you nuke a country. And what good does it do to nuke a country if you can't occupy and control it? You just create a hornet's nest and they rebuild and they come back after you. So you see, if you don't have a conventional military big enough to occupy, you don't throw nuclear weapons out there. And I'll tell you why that relates to China later on. Now, Russia does have the largest and most advanced nuclear missile force in the world. They will be used someday, but only when China, with its burgeoning conventional and nuclear forces, is ready to back Russia up. China's conventional weapons now outnumber the U.S. in every military category, and also as a key contributor that Russia's counting on, because without China, Russia, as I say, can't occupy the West and consolidate a nuclear victory. But the weakened Russia is now moving into full war footing production, and this is a change. It means that the West doesn't keep up the war in Ukraine, draining Russia's munitions and manpower. Russia will rebuild its offensive capability over the next couple of years, learn from its flawed mistakes in Ukraine, and become a real threat to both Ukraine again and the Baltic states as well, which have hundreds of thousands of Russians inside their border. These Russians were placed there by the Soviets just for this purpose, so they could claim the need to invade and protect them just like they did in the Donbass and Crimea. Now, one of my favorite military channels, and many military people have this as a favorite channel on YouTube, is Ward Carroll. He's a former F-14 radar intercept officer and pretty savvy guy. He runs an internet channel where he interviews a lot of people who really know their stuff militarily. His favorite guest is Justin Bronk, a PhD from UK, or the Royal United Services Institute, acronym RUSI. By far the best and brightest military analyst in the world, in my opinion, and many other opinion. He never wastes words. He can recite the capabilities of every major weapon system in the world from memory. He knows the full range of military tactics, and most importantly, is always direct, straightforward, and honest without being biased or dogmatic like former Colonel Doug McGregor or Scott Ritter, who are little more than pro-Russian shills. Carroll's interview with Bronk is always interesting, and I have a link in the current World Affairs Brief to that interview on YouTube. But you can just look up Ward Carroll and find him there. He first addresses the state of NATO's readiness for a future confrontation with Russia. Having just toured Europe's premier aviation bases allowed to fly in their aircraft, and he talks about the declining state of NATO's land armies, not because they aren't well trained and have good tanks, they do, but they don't have enough of them. Although highly trained, as I say, they just haven't made the financial commitment to fund a large enough army. And in the EU, you have to understand that you're dealing with 30 or 40 countries, and trying to get them all to agree on budgets and things is just a mess. Bronk says the aircraft NATO flies are very capable. They are, but somewhat limited in quantities, as many are waiting to take delivery on the F-35, the most capable aircraft in the world at finding and attacking multiple aircraft simultaneously and coordinating target information with other nearby aircraft. No other aircraft in the world can do this. In other words, an F-35 can come in and target up to 20 targets at a time and then share that information with other aircraft. They usually fly in 4-ship formations, including dealing with an AWACS airplane, which has longer range AOR, and they can just trade information around, and they can tell friend from foe, they can tell who's who in the battlefield, and no other Air Force can do that. This is called combined arms. Combined arms coordinates and deconflicts, meaning makes sure that there's no conflict between the air war, the armored war on the ground, the infantry, the naval gunfire, the missile attacks, in a high-threat environment. And you think about the complexity of missiles flying through the air and various enemy aircraft and allied nation aircraft, and to be able to sort out who's who and not shoot down your friends. This is a very complex thing, and only the West knows how to do this at great expense and training. But NATO's biggest problem is basing both their aircraft and their ground forces. NATO aircraft and armored forces are concentrated in a few major big bases. And the U.S. has closed down a lot of bases too, and does just a few, like in Germany and in Italy they have a base. And the trouble is with this, and this is because they don't have a lot of empty space in Europe. They don't have a lot of wide open deserts to do training and shoot live ammunition as we do in the United States. It's highly densely populated. But this basing everything you have in about 20 different bases makes you extremely vulnerable to Russian missile attacks, because they can take out all of your aircraft and your armor with very few strikes. Now, training in the EU is good on the fundamentals and better than in Russia and China, but NATO follows U.S. air power doctrine that is very complex. Think of this: integrated air defenses, identifying friend from foe, multi-aircraft formations, air combat practice, air-to-ground attack, anti-radar missions with HARM missiles, and anti-aircraft missions with AMRAAM missiles, electronic warfare, aerial refueling, and they do all this with one type of aircraft if they need to. The F-35 can do it all. Now, they have multiple aircraft that do some of these better than others. But this is complex. Can you imagine training for that kind of mission and that many missions? This is one of the conundrums. Now, you may say this is too much detail for a big picture view of the war in Ukraine, but it isn't, because you have to know these details to know how difficult it is to resolve the situation in Europe and why Europe is so difficult coming up to speed as the U.S. has tried to get them to do and spend more money on military operations. It's complex. So even though NATO pilots get comparable flight hours to U.S. crews, they don't have the training airspace, think open deserts, like the U.S. So they can't put up huge formations of aircraft with air refueling assets and do live ammunition missile shoots. So Justin Bronk, very smart guy, he says, I would suggest that NATO take their various and specialize in some roles and some do other roles. But, that's very difficult to do in Europe because then you've got to depend on the other guy to credibly train their crews. You got to depend on them to show up at a war when you need their crews. And it's very difficult in the disparate circumstances. Now, the U.S. has a particularly high level of readiness right now, especially with its aircraft wing of aviation. It has 8 out of 11 aircraft carrier groups out at ocean in deployment right now. And usually they only have half of the aircraft carriers out. This is a major readiness thing. Now, it's not as high for the rest of the Navy, which is not in as good a shape, nor the Army. But the lesson, Bronk says, in the Ukraine war is the number of munitions you burn through. Quote, think of a ludicrous number, double it, add a zero, and you're still not there. In particular, 155 millimeter artillery shells, which has created 80% of the casualties on both sides of the war. They're burning through artillery shells, both in Russia and Ukraine, like crazy. And then that becomes the supply problem. You see, the UK or the EU has been giving artillery shells to Ukraine only out of existing stock, and they're running low, and they're not increasing production. Now, the US has increased production. They've got a whole new factory starting to produce shells and missiles, but not Europe. And so that's going to be a long-term problem that he will address. But one of the problems with, and he takes some time to discuss the new F-16s that are coming to Ukraine. And this is a big game changer, or it could be if they do it right. And there are numerous Ukrainian pilots right now training on F-16s in various European countries. Countries like Denmark and others who are set to receive the F-35 are giving away all their F-16s to Ukraine. So it's an ongoing process destined to give Ukraine some 200 aircraft and parts. And basic training to fly the Falcon is not that hard for experienced pilots used to already flying the MiG-21, MiG-29, and Su-27, although the F-16 is a fly-by-wire airplane. Now, I come from the F-4, where you have a real stick where you move and control the ailerons and stabilator through hydraulics. When I went into a simulator with an F-15, courtesy of some Air Force friends, they have a completely different stick. You just lean on it. You hardly move it at all. You just put pressure on it. And it's very difficult to get used to it. Now, every pilot gets used to it, but it's a real game changer. I mean, it's really different than flying a MiG or an F-4 that has a real stick that moves. But much more is required to use the F-16 to its full tactical advantage in accordance to U.S. air doctrine, which I'll discuss in a minute. But the difficulty of giving them F-16s is how do you protect them from Russian missiles once they get into Ukraine? And how do you maintain them? U.S. maintenance is for a complex aircraft like the F-16 involves several American specialty contractors who are factory trained, but American policy doesn't allow any American contractors in Ukraine. Now, they have some in secret, not aircraft maintenance, but other special forces and trainers. But Ukraine also has this doctrine of dispersal of their aircraft to save them from being obliterated. In other words, instead of having a few big bases which can be hit by the Russians, they have dozens and dozens of little bases with 2 or 3 aircraft in each base. These are tiny rural bases, and what happens is because the Russians have superiority in SAMs, or surface-to-air missiles, the Ukrainians have to stay low to the ground when they fly, and that uses a lot of fuel. So when they get up towards the battle lines, they have small refueling with runways, sometimes roads to land on, where they have a fuel depot, and they fill up the aircraft, and they take off again and fly around. Well, you can't do that with an F-16, because an F-16 has this big air scoop right on the bottom of the airplane, a few feet off the runway, and it's very subject to what they call FOD, F-O-D, foreign object damage. You gun the airplane, it starts to suck up gravel and other things, that's going to ruin your engine. And so F-16s required a pristine runway and pristine taxiways. They don't have that in Ukraine. It's going to take, Bronk says, about a year for them to upgrade these small dispersal sites. And then you got a problem. Ukrainian Air Force is down to 30 or 40 airplanes now, and you put in 200. Now, where do you disperse them to? And how do you disperse the maintenance? F-16s are used to have a big base with a maintenance crew all centralized with your American contractors. And how do you divide all those people up? You don't have enough maintenance people to divide them up among all these dispersed air bases. So there's a problem. Bronk thinks the Swedish Gripen aircraft would be a much better choice because it's designed for rural bases. It's designed to land on roads. It only takes 3 people to maintain them. It's ideal, but you don't have a lot of excess Gripens to give to Ukraine. He's not suggesting it's a replacement for the F-16, but a complement. And then there's the training tactics in an F-16. To use them properly, you see, the Ukrainians are used to old Soviet doctrine. They take off in big formations, but they're just flying together for general protection. They don't go into combat together. And they do their individual run, and Soviet doctrine is that ground forces control the airplanes. So it's mostly ground attack, and so the ground forces tell them what to do and where to go. That's not the way American doctrine goes. It's much more sophisticated. You fly off in a 2 or 4 or 6 ship formation, and each of those airplanes have different things. Some are targeting radar sites with HARM missiles. Some are targeting aircraft out there that are coming into combat. Some are doing electronic jamming of other things. And so you come in with a large force of information, and they fight their way into the battle by destroying the enemy and by destroying radars and other SAM missile sites. So then they can do ground attack. And they aren't controlled by the ground. They have their own air controllers and aircraft picking out targets in communication with the ground. So it's a whole different ballgame, which the Ukrainian pilots have to get used to. And it takes at least a year to become a leader of a 2-ship F-16 formation. It takes 3 to 4 years to become a leader, a briefer, and to manage tactics of a 4-ship formation. So you can maybe cut that down a little bit, but it's not going to be able to do that as rapidly as possible. Bronk does take issue with Ukrainian statistics on Russian combat air losses of aircraft. Ukrainians claim 325 Russian aircraft have been downed and 320,000 soldiers have been killed. Now, as Bronk says, both sides of the war inflate for propaganda purposes. He says the real number, because he has access to satellite intelligence counting wrecked aircraft, he says the real number for downed Russian aircraft is about in the 80s. And he says the only way that the manpower losses could be 320,000 if you count all the wounded and the recoverables, meaning the people who are wounded that can get back into combat. But the air losses are way off. But the most important thing Bronk had to offer in this video interview is the long-range outlook for the war. And he offered some very cogent comments. He noted that the war in Israel has not changed the war calculus in Ukraine so far, as the IDF has relied mostly on air-to-air bombing of Gaza and not used artillery very much. So there's no competition for 155 millimeter artillery shells, which the U.S. supplies to Israel and Ukraine. And but what it has changed is that it's taken all the policy initiative away from Ukraine and put it onto Israel. And he says what Ukraine really needs is long-term support because Russia is preparing for a long war and is already geared up to a wartime production, producing many more artillery shells, including importing artillery shells from North Korea and China than Ukraine receives from the West. Artillery, says, is the main way in which the Ukrainians have ground their way forward and taken back ground, only about 10% of the Donbass occupied by the Soviets or the Russians, and at great cost. They've caused massive attrition of Russian forces, which keeps Russia from being able to gather enough troops to mount a significant offensive, and that's been true. There's been no significant offensive. All of the conscripts from Russia are immediately being deployed to replace killed and wounded Russians on the front lines. So even Ukraine is not making much progress on ground. They are keeping the Russian forces contained. This is not sustainable in the long term, he says, unless the U.S. and NATO ramp up production of artillery and missile production massively. Now, the U.S. has ramped up, as I said, artillery production, but Europe has not. The U.S. does face competing demands. It also has munitions that it provides South Korea and Israel, and then Taiwan. It is throwing a lot of munitions into Taiwan to try to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And as Bronk says, it's much cheaper to deter a war than to fight a war. So it really pays to throw in weaponry to deter this. In Europe, the problem is they parse out a little bit of artillerymen to each manufacturer because every country's got to have their share. And so nobody ramps up production because they're not getting big orders. And if they do ramp up production, that order ends, and then they've got a lot of layoffs, and that's unpopular politically. So he suggests that you pick one or two of the biggest manufacturers and give them big orders and pick other manufacturers to do other things in other countries so that the big orders at least justify ramping up production. He says the West needs a massive increase in weapons production capacity just to meet the challenge of China, and believe me, that is true, let alone Russia and Iran. This is much more to the point of ultimate defense, he said, than printing trillions to give away to people for COVID reparations and other inflationary tactics in the U.S. And I heartily agree. And so people readily accepted the money, but it's entirely inflationary. And that inflation isn't stopping because our banking system is weak, and they have to keep inflating this bubble, and that's why the Fed just keeps churning out money, a lot more than what they say is M1 and M2. They're lying about the money supply. In fact, they keep shoveling money overseas and not putting it on the books. And that's why there really can't be a central bank digital currency without cash, because there's trillions of dollars of cash out there, and every country in the world has been stockpiling dollars. When there was a banking collapse in Argentina in the year 2000, over $50 billion in cash came out of Argentine hiding places. And I've lived in Argentina. I know how they hoard dollars because they're running an inflation of anywhere from 150% a year to 600%. And so the dollar is a stable currency. And there would be riots in the streets all over the world if the U.S. didn't accept those dollars anymore. Then besides, in an EMP strike, even the elite are going to need cash. Well, as for a negotiated settlement, well, let me just say here, quoting Bronk on the defense of Europe, he says, in Europe, the defense of Ukraine is treated as an inconvenient distraction. Oh, we have to keep supplying Ukraine, they whine, without realizing they're really fighting a major future war with Russia. Yes, it is difficult, it's inconvenient, and there are other social welfare needs that won't be met, but the enemy has made that decision for you, and we will face war one way or the other in the not distant future, and that will be a world war. He's right. Bronk said, I'd rather be accused of being an alarmist now than face people a couple of years down the road saying, oh gosh, now we've got a real problem with Russia and all our solutions are 3 years away. And that's what happens when you don't ramp up production ahead of time. It's different than World War II. You know, in a year we had all these ships being built, these Liberty ships and airplanes coming out the gazoo and factories putting out, 14 B-24s in a day. It was just tremendous. But these are low-tech weapons. It's easy to ramp up in a year for low-tech. It's not easy for high-tech weapons. You have to plan ahead. They won't wait longer than that, even if they have their military forces. Well, he's saying, in a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, all we would get, he says, from Russia is a 6-month pause in fighting. And then you'd get exactly what Putin did in Syria, in Georgia, and Chechnya. That is, use the pause to regroup for a final offensive to come back and win the war. And that's the way aggressors always use ceasefires, especially communists. They did that in China. They did it in Russia when the U.S. cut off supply. They did that. Every time the U.S. has created, whether it was Batista in Cuba, whether it was Somoza in Nicaragua, and they forced them to make a ceasefire with the communists regroup. The U.S. cuts off military aid to the pro-Western government, and they come back and win the war in 6 months. That's what happened to Chiang Kai-shek. George C. Marshall, a globalist, told Chiang Kai-shek, you got to go into a coalition government with Mao Zedong, who was being financed and armed by the Russians. And Chiang Kai-shek refused because he knew that the Chinese would use that coalition government to take over. And so Marshall cut off all military aid to him. Now, if you read the Wikipedia article on why Chiang Kai-shek lost, they tell you it's because he didn't have the support of his troops and they all deserted. Well, if you didn't have any arms and ammunition, you'd desert too. That was the Americans' fault for cutting off aid to Chiang Kai-shek. Same thing happened with Batista's forces. In fact, we even know now that the CIA gave arms to Castro. I mean, this is treason. So in the negotiated settlement in Ukraine, all we would get is 6 months from Russia, and then you'd get a pause, and then you'd have coming back in with a major offensive. They wouldn't wait longer than 6 months, because longer than 6 months, you'd give Ukraine a chance to build up their defenses again defensively. And they won't do that. Now, I'm going to contrast Bronk's views with those of David Pine, a mainstream geopolitical analyst who spoke to this group last month. The same group I'm addressing now. And the reason I'm doing this is because Pine is a semi-conservative, but received his education from Georgetown School of Foreign Service, the most globalist-oriented school in the U.S., whose professors indoctrinate all of our high-ranking military officers in globalist thought, along with their deceptive view of history. So that's where he comes from, and that's why his history is so bad that you heard. Now, you may not have picked it up, but I'm going to clarify where he was wrong. Although Pine's professional presentation appeared logical and coherent, complete with a long slideshow of historical dates and events, it was all mainstream globalist interpretations of history. With all the current fallacies, the number one, Russia wanted to join NATO after the phony fall of the Soviet Union. The West rejected that and then broke several agreements they made with Russia about not letting former Soviet states join NATO. That's all true, but that's not the whole story. In the Ukraine issue, he falls into the typical trap of saying the U.S. provoked it by overthrowing the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, a communist. But as I've pointed out numerous times in the World Affairs Brief, it wasn't a Western coup at all, even though the West financed the protester movement. It was the communist president that ordered the Berkut, the riot police that surrounded and wouldn't let the protesters out of the Maidan Square, that let them win. They got a stand-down order. Now, the protesters couldn't have given that. Only the communist president could have given the stand order. And why would he do that? Why would he let them think that they had won? Well, just like the phony fall of the Soviet Union, which I'll go over in a minute, the communist president of Ukraine faked the coup in Ukraine in order to help elect a false Ukrainian nationalist, Piotr Poroshenko, so he could provoke the Russian majority in eastern Ukraine, which in turn justified Putin's stealth invasion of Crimea. You see, a communist president couldn't provoke the Russians. They would say, why is he's pro-Russian, why is he provoking us? So what they did, he faked the coup as a Western coup, then had Piotr Poroshenko come in, playing like he was a Ukrainian nationalist, but he wasn't. Just like most of the previous presidents of Ukraine were actually Putin acolytes, faking it of being Ukrainian nationalists like Timoshenko. So Poroshenko comes in and says, you can speak Russian in Ukraine. I'm going to be, give peace to everybody and thing. And when he became president, then he said, no, you got to speak Ukrainian in the Russian areas, and he antagonized them. And he sent the military in there to antagonize them. You see, a communist president couldn't have gotten away with that. But the appearance of a pro-Western president would then justify Putin say, I've got to come in and save them. And that's when he made his stealth invasion of Crimea in 2014. So remember, in fact, even the Wikipedia, which is a CIA operation, even Wikipedia mentioned the Berkut stand down, and then they made it disappear. Maybe they read my stuff and knew that this was a key thing that made people realize this could only have been a communist coup. And in fact, Viktor Yanukovych on Saturday was voted out of office by his own parliament, which was controlled by communists and their allies. Now, why would they kick out their own president? And then he claimed he was fleeing for his life and going to Russia. Well, who was he fleeing from? None of the protesters were armed. You see, this is like the January 6th protesters going to the White House and there were no Capitol Police there. It was wide open. Could the protesters have created a stand down? And then it's like the Democratic-controlled Congress would oust Barack Obama from the presidency. Would that have been believable? Well, that's exactly what happened in Ukraine. So it wasn't a Western coup. It wasn't a provocation. But the West didn't blow the whistle on him because, you see, the West actually wants Russia to create a war with the West. They need this war. They want this war. Russia wants the war. China wants the war. They're just maneuvering for who's going to start the war and who to blame. Now, as I've done in the World Affairs Brief, I will explain how this view of history that Pine projected is totally at variance with the conspiratorial facts of history. How Russia and China have always been allies, because Pine says we drove Russia into the arms of China by provoking them and by taking Ukraine's side. Not true at all. Russia and China have always been allies since their very creation, which was aided, of course, and abetted by Western globalists for conflict and war creation purposes. He's also completely ignorant on how the Soviets faked their own demise in 1989 and 90 and in order to get Western aid and trade to make up for their failing to keep up with the conventional weaponry of the United States. Pine is ignorant of the fact that Soviets put Crimea and Donbass within Ukraine's borders in order to have an excuse to invade after the phony fall. He's also ignorant of the fact that Ukraine's coup wasn't a Western coup, as I've just explained. Paine's solution to the thing is all too naive. He says, stay out of China and Russia's near domain and make further disarmament agreements with them to keep the peace, as it did during the Cold War. What the root of his thinking is a failure to understand real systematic evil in the world and Satan's role in controlling all of the three globalist predator centers, Russia, China, and the Western globalists, which we deal with. And the deep state, by the way, is the enforcement arm of the larger globalist conspiracy. How can you recommend negotiations with satanic-controlled predators that don't have any intention to abide by agreements, except as to delay a military response against them and buy time? I fear he continues to play up to the establishment because he's hoping for positions of foreign policy influence. And of course, if you even hint that you believe in conspiracy, you'll be blackballed and you won't ever get a job. He's been a foreign policy advisor to Mike Lee, he is no longer, and now for Vivek Ramaswamy. But you see, he's got a bunch of bad history that he learned at Georgetown. He said, we ended the Cold War with a victory, that is, the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed and communism collapsed, hooray. That's entirely untrue. The Cold War was never a victory, because just because we didn't have a nuclear war doesn't mean it was a victory. We used containment, which was preached by Kissinger and all the other globalists in every administration, and disarmament treaties as an excuse to allow Russia to continue to build up their nuclear arsenal, which they did. They're now 5 times bigger than ours. We took down, as Pine said, 90% of our nuclear capacity, and they built it to 5 times our large. And they used their subterfuge and influence to subvert other countries. They invaded Cuba, Nicaragua, South Africa, and many other African nations which they control now. Now, China has taken over a lot of that because Russia is so underpowered now with their war in Ukraine. And we transferred dangerous technology to both Russia and China, including miniature ball-bearing technology so they could build the small gyros sensitive enough to provide guidance for multiple warheads on nuclear missiles. That's called MIRVing, M-I-R-V, your warheads, multiple independent reentry vehicles. Long after we provided them the rest of the plans to the nuclear weapons they couldn't steal in the Manhattan Project, we gave it to them in Lend-Lease. Major Racy Jordan out of the Montana Air Base saw all these big black trunks going aboard an airplane from the Soviets, and he stopped them. It had diplomatic seal, and he broke the diplomatic seal, which has caused the Russians to get apoplectic. And the Russians made a phone call, and Racy Jordan got a call back from Harry Hopkins of the Truman White House saying, give those trunks back to the Soviets and don't tell anybody what you saw on them. Well, he saw nuclear plans in there. The U.S. was giving the Russians the rest of the nuclear plans they couldn't steal in the Manhattan Project. And then we gave them the first shipment of enriched uranium in 1948 so that they could, this was after the war. Lend-Lease shouldn't have been going on, but under Lend-Lease, we gave them the first shipment of enriched uranium because they didn't know how to enrich uranium. So that the Soviets exploded their first nuclear weapon in 1949. They could never have done that without U.S. assistance. He says, then we squandered our victory and made Russia an enemy. No, it wasn't a victory in '89. The Soviets faked their own fall, just as Anatoly Golitsyn, the most important defector from the Soviet Union, warned in his book, The Perestroika, Deception and New Lies for Old. He told them that for years the communists have been planning on faking their own demise in order to get Western aid and trade. The communists have been an enemy since 1917 when we and the British provided $40 million in gold to pay for the Bolshevik revolution. And then when the White Russian armies fought them and would have won, we cut off military aid to the White Russian armies, just like we cut off aid to Chiang Kai-shek, just like we cut off military aid to Batista, just like we cut off aid to Somoza. Do you see a pattern here? It's very disturbing. Now, it's not because, yes, there were a lot of communists. McCarthy was right. There were hundreds of communists in the State Department. But a lot of those communists were actually globalists, like Alger Hiss and Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger, when he was in Germany, joined the Communist Party. So that when he did all of this in their behalf, as their great friend, they wouldn't think anything about it because he was a member of the party secretly. They kept his secret. But he really wasn't a communist. He was a globalist, which used communism to break down the world through wars so they can come in and rescue with their milder form of socialism. This is how complex this is. Alger Hiss was not a communist, even though he joined the Communist Party. He was a globalist and did their bidding. He claims, he predicted in the year 2000 that Russia and China would become military allies, which they formalized 6 months later. But they've always been allies. Russia armed Mao in China. He helped China all during the Vietnam War. Russia and China both took American POWs out of Indochina and did medical experiments on them. Russia gave China the nuclear technology to build their first nuclear weapon, and they gave them the technology to MIRV their missiles. He says our nuclear arsenal kept the peace with Russia during the Cold War, and then we reduced it by 90%, especially in theater weapons in Europe with the INF Treaty. But he doesn't mention, he didn't tell you that the Russians cheated on that. He didn't tell you that after the phony fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. found out that all the SS-23 missiles that Russia claimed they were going to dismantle in the INF Treaty were still in their caves in Eastern Europe. And that's two of the leaders, major leaders of the so-called Western Alliance in Eastern Europe, Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia and Lech Walesa of Poland, were both Soviet agents. That's right. The leader of the Solidarity movement, which was so-called pro-Western, was actually a Soviet agent. And that's how they do. They control both sides of the equation. Now, he's right. Pine is right that Russia now has almost 5 times the operational nukes that we have. And China's on track to about 3 times that. And why is that? Because we signed disarmament agreements, the same agreements that Pine wants us to sign again to supposedly have peace. He's got to wake up. It's not going to give us peace. Then he says we spent $6 trillion on wars in the Middle East, which we have no national interest in fighting, which is true. But he's ignorant of the real reason why the deep state created the attack on 9/11 and started a phony war on terror to justify intervention in the Middle East, and to pass the Patriot Act, which opened up domestic spying on Americans and allowed for secret tribunals, the FISA court, which is now up for renewal. And I hope the Republicans have the guts not to renew that FISA court. And it was the deep state that loaded all the explosives in the World Trade Center and hired the terrorists, etc., that couldn't fly these airliners. He says Putin was actually pro-Western when he took power, which is a total lie. You see, Putin has a major disinformation campaign, which most conservatives have bought into, and I'll tell you why. They bought into it because they think, correctly, that the globalist wars on terror were unjustified and wrong to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. And they were right about that. But they've wrongly assumed, including my good friend Ron Paul, to think that anybody the globalists must be against has to be our friends. It has to be a good guy. It's not true. Because before the next world war, the globalists, instead of building up these enemies, giving them arms and ammunition, giving them technology, they have to start to turn against them. Otherwise, they get blamed for the war. And that's exactly what the deep state has done. They started to fight Russia. They've started to do the right thing and diminish it and work on its conventional and weaken it because they know the war is coming, and they've got to exonerate them. So it's an evil motive either way. You know, they're just covering for their prior evil. But conservatives have bought it hook, line, and sinker that Putin is a Christian because he's aiding the Orthodox Church. Well, let me tell you something. In Soviet years, the Soviets completely co-opted the Orthodox Church. They had communists throughout the entire hierarchy. That's why the Orthodox Church never criticized Stalin and all his killing of millions of people. So it's no big deal when someone claims to be a Christian and helps the Orthodox Church, who has been subverted for many years. And Christians don't bomb civilians in cities and kill a lot of things. And Christians don't take children away from their parents and indoctrinate them. Christians aren't allowed to be colonels in the KGB. Wake up, conservatives. Putin is no Christian, even though there's a major propaganda decrying transgenders and gay things, making you feel, yes, he's for Western values. He's just fooling you. Russia has the highest divorce rate, alcoholism, and other things, and otherwise a very corrupt society. So it's just very convenient that he attacks the Western weakness, which the globalists are promoting, against family values. Now let me give you the evidence of the phony fall of the Soviet Union. And I'll tell you, the deep state knows that they faked their own demise. And why didn't they say anything about it? Because they were still in the mode of helping Russia gain aid and trade. And if they blew the whistle on them that it was a phony fall, they wouldn't have been able to justify all the aid, including the suitcases full of $100 bills they were shipping to Moscow every week out of JFK Airport. That's why the oligarchs had only $100 bills to give to tips. They had no 10s or 20s because they were getting $100 bills from the U.S. Well, number one, Erich Honecker, dictator of East Germany, admitted on his deathbed in Chile that Moscow gave him orders to let the student protests in Leipzig, that's where it all started, in Leipzig, Germany, at the university, proving that the fall was not spontaneous, but directed by Moscow. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't an inbred hunger for freedom among all the East Germans. There was. But those protests started the movement by letting people think they were free to rebel. And, you know, the students themselves said, where are the Stasi? We didn't dare rebel before. But I think those same Stasi agents within the student groups whispered among them, it's okay, we're going to be allowed to protest. There's always, all student organizations were infiltrated, as I said, and I presume those spies began to encourage students to protest. That's the only way a, quote, spontaneous uprising could have begun in a repressive state. Number two, the Russian press said that the KGB failed to capture Gorbachev in his undefended villa. Is that believable? The KGB had overthrown whole governments before and specialized in being able to assassinate in will, and yet all the most powerful and sinister organizations of oppression in Soviet Russia suddenly failed to capture Gorby. Is that believable? Well, number three, while the alcoholic Boris Yeltsin was addressing student protesters in Red Square atop the tank, the television stations airing his speech and giving it prime time were still under the control of the communists. Why didn't they pull the plug? I watched a documentary featuring Russian students who were part of the protest, listening and applauding Yeltsin. And one student is seen asking, the only thing we couldn't understand was, where were the KGB? They were always following us everywhere and tracking everything we did, but it was because the AGB obviously had a stand down, just like the Stasi. Number four, it was announced that the counter-coup against Gorbachev had failed after they failed to capture him in his undefended villa. And the defense minister, the head of the KGB and the GRU, the military intelligence, supposedly fled for their lives. No one in the media, no one in the U.S. government, except myself, asked the question, who were they fleeing from? When you're the head of the military, the KGB, and the GRI, who do you flee from? Unless you're simply puppets and told to flee as part of the ruse. In fact, each of those heads were mid-level bureaucrats a year before they were elevated to these high positions. Whoever put them in that held real power, not them. The same goes for Gorbachev and the entire Politburo. Gorby was a mid-level arms negotiator 2 years before he named head of the Politburo. And so were most of the others. Whoever chose them were the real hidden leaders. Now, if I can find this out, as a person without a high security clearance, certainly Pine at Georgetown University could have, had they told him the truth. But they give you a selective view of history. It's the establishment view. It's all through Wikipedia. Those hidden communist leaders turned out to be the new oligarchs who emerged after the, quote, fall. Boris Berezovsky and friends, who had the power to tell the Russian state bank to loan them the money to buy up the oil industry, Gazprom, and media company. Now, they didn't have the money, but the state bank knew that these were the real Soviet leaders, and when they told them to loan the money, they loaned the money. Only the real hidden communist leaders could have had that kind of power over the Soviet state bank. Now, Berezovsky became head of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, promoting the image of a peaceful version of the Soviet Union, but Berezovsky was still the real leader of the continuing Soviets, as Christopher Story of the UK would write. He coined that term. He's dead now. A Russian blogger wrote that inside the Kremlin, he saw Yeltsin and Berezovsky and several other high Russian leaders go into a room for a meeting, and Yeltsin stepped aside to let Berezovsky go in first. Protocol left over from Soviet days indicating that Yeltsin knew that Berezovsky was the real leader. Now, historically, and this is an important general statement, there are zero examples of any tyrannical government that has voluntarily stepped down and repented of their evil. They've all been overthrown by force, except this one, which I don't believe for a minute was real. As further proof, the Soviets never disarmed, though they allowed the U.S. to pay for the massive cleanup of Soviet bioweapons labs while the Russians built new ones. The U.S. dismantled all their older SS-18 liquid-fueled missiles that were outdated, and then allowed the Russians to keep all the warheads, and even built a new warhead refurbishing factory under the Nunn-Lugar legislation, which the Russians promptly locked the U.S. inspectors out of once it was complete. The U.S. never complained publicly about this, indicating they were helping Russia cover for this ruse, part of the long-standing secret policy of building future enemies. The Soviets never told the West, even after the fall, that they had deceived the West in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and never dismantled their S-23 missiles. Now, if they'd really repented and really said, they would have said, oh, by the way, we're sorry, but we cheated on this. They never admitted that. The Soviets created leaders who would appear friendly to the West. I talked about Lech Walesa of Solidarity Lech Walesa of Solidarity and Václav Havel. In preparation for the fall, the Soviets put the Russian-speaking regions of Donbass and Crimea within the boundaries of Ukraine, so they could have an excuse to reinvade when these Russian people felt threatened. The Soviets also forced hundreds of thousands of Russians to immigrate to the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and they're there to this day. They're still there, and we see them, and we will see them used as an excuse to invade there someday. Yeltsin, the puppet, the drunk, was eventually replaced by Vladimir Putin, and listen to this, who met with Berezovsky 5 times in Berezovsky's villa in Spain the year he ascended to the presidency, showing that Berezovsky was the real behind-the-scene leaders. And if Spanish intelligence knew this, certainly they would have told the CIA, who continued to cover for the phony fall. Putin eventually had Berezovsky murdered in London and the rest of the original oligarchs jailed or exiled, picking instead new, younger oligarchs who promised to give him a cut of their earnings in exchange for protection, making Putin the wealthiest man in the world. You talk about corruption of Zelensky, Putin's even worse. As for Putin's support, and by the way, the corruption in Ukraine and in Romania and in Hungary and in all the old former states is because after the phony fall, they never removed any of the communist bureaucrats from government. You know, they denazified everything in Germany after World War II, but they didn't do that after the phony fall. And so the people still had to pay bribes and corruption for everything. And that's why corruption is so, common in Ukraine, because it's the old Soviet system of corruption. That doesn't mean that everybody's corrupt. There are some beta, but Zelensky's corrupt, but he's a piker compared to Putin and what's going on in Russia. He buys into the falsehood that there was a nuclear risk in the Ukraine war to Ukraine, but none of that is true. Putin can't occupy the entire Ukraine if he nuked it, and neither could he occupy Western Europe. Doesn't have the conventional forces to do that. And he misrepresented the U.S. position. He said, the U.S. position is, in order to avoid World War III, we have to fight World War III today with Russia and Ukraine. No. The globalists actually want World War III. That's part of the reason why they're provoking and weakening Russia. They want Russia eventually to use their nuclear weapons. And because, you see, we have Presidential Decision Directive 60, which, by the way, I don't know whether you got this from me. I was the first one to alert the nation to this secret military order that tells our nuclear forces to absorb a nuclear first strike and not launch on warning, which is suicide. You see, the advantage in launching on warning is their missiles are targeting our missile silos, and they're empty by the time they hit. And our missiles are in the air, and they hit live targets. So who launches second in a launch on warning wins. And that's why China is setting up missile silos. They're planning on launching on warning rather than allowing the U.S. to hit those. But Pine does know about PDD-60. He mentioned it. And it's a real suicidal risk. But he misrepresents the position by saying that the U.S. people or U.S. government wants to avoid World War III, but they don't want to avoid. They want World War III because that's the only way they talk you and me into a global new world order or joining a global government. If they let a nuclear first strike on military targets, and that's what's going to happen, it's not cities per se, the military, they want the U.S. military decapitated. China and Russia want it so they can blackmail us into submission. They don't want to ruin the country. They don't want to destroy the infrastructure. Remember, they can't innovate. They want to milk the West for what it is, not destroy it. But in order to blackmail them successfully, you've got to hit the military. That's why I'm not recommending any of your children go into the military, or if they're in the military, get out, because your government will not protect you. They'll be targeted, and they'll let those missiles fall. Now, the globalists aren't stupid. They're not going to lose the war because they allow the military to be decapitated, and they're not going to submit to the blackmail. Now, how do you stop blackmail if you've been nuked in the military? You have space-based weapons that can stop any further missiles from hitting cities. So you can thumb your nose at the blackmail. I think that's what's happened. That's what General Mattis told a Booz Allen private conference. He said, you'd be surprised how many billions are going into space that aren't on the budget. Well, everything on the budget I know about is there. all the GPS satellites, all the surveillance satellites, all the testing and that's all the international, it's all on the budget. So if there are billions going in the budget that aren't on the budget, going into space, the U.S. is building space-based weapons. And I think that's their secret code of how you stop the blackmail of World War III after you absorb a nuclear first strike. But it's not going to be good for America. You're going to have an EMP strike that hits first. And it's going to take down the grid for over a year. And you think about living without electricity. No trucking, no shipping food from California, no grocery stores. Everything will be empty in 3 days. No water supply, no sewer, and chaos because people start to pillage. That's a real recipe for them. You read the book one second after, and the only real mistake in that book is it talks about a single EMP. It takes more than one EMP to take down the whole grid. It takes 7 or 8, and that's why only Russia and China can do this, not Iran, not North Korea. Take down part of the grid, but not the whole grid without 7 or 8 nuclear weapons. But it's going to be a preliminary to a nuclear war. And so if you see all the lights go out and all the television and radio stations go dark, you got about 15, 20 minutes before the nuke starts to fall on Hill Air Force Base and other targets. And if you're living near Hill Air Force Base, you need to be really worried because that's going to be a nuclear zone, a blast zone, out to about 10 miles. And from then on, whichever way the wind's blowing, from the south or from the northwest, you're going to get a load of fallout going out about 50 miles. So you need fallout protection. So that's one of the things that I have taken time. I've known this since I was 17 when I read my uncle's book, The Naked Communist. And even Ezra Taft Benson in the LDS Church was all concerned with the communist threat. And the problem with that is that they really didn't understand the globalist threat and how the globalists were allowing, and I saw that even in Cleon's book. He talked about the second floor of the State Department, how all these State Department people were undermining Batista and other nations that fell to the communists. And they were communists in the State Department. But there were higher-ups who were protecting them because every time you'd go to try to fire one of these people, somebody way higher up would say, no, you can't fire them. And I got to figure, something more than just communists, there's some non-communists up there that are protecting the communists. Why are they doing that? Well, I didn't figure that out for several years until I went to Washington as the chairman of the Conservative National Committee during the Reagan administration. And as good as Reagan was as a conservative, he made a lot of compromises. And one of the worst that he made, because of threats from the media that they would destroy his candidacy if they didn't take George H.W. Bush as his vice president and let him control personnel, that was a sabotage on the Reagan administration because he had no control over personnel, and George H.W. Bush, a globalist, brought in a lot of homosexuals into the White House during the Reagan administration and undermined him at every point. And Reagan fought back until they threw that assassination attempt at him, and then he was very compliant after that. He and Nancy Reagan started to go to soothsayer, seance, and try to get spiritualistic help and protection. That's not the right place to go. But this is what we're facing, and I'm not going to take time to go through the part of my speech where I talk about the China threat, but it's much bigger than the Soviet threat right now, except for nuclear missiles. Oh, thank you. Except for Russian missiles. Russia has the largest missile forces, and they're going to be devastating, and they're very accurate. And they have 15 maneuvering warheads on the newest version of their missiles. And we have less than 400, or about 400 Minuteman III missiles that are no longer 3-warhead Minuteman IIIs. They're Minuteman Is now with 1 warhead. Now they're going to be replaced by the new Sentinel missile that the U.S. is building, but it's not going to be deployed till after 2030. And it's my suspicion that Russia and China, seeing this, will say, I think we better strike before 2030, before that missile gets deployed. And I think that's what's going to happen. China says there'll be a world-class military power by 2027. Now, I've never tried to tell you when I think this war is coming, but I try to tell people what I think the trigger event is to watch for. China isn't ready yet, And it probably won't be ready till around the 2027 area, but it could be. They could be faking it. They put out a news thing that they'd be ready in 2043, which was lying. Their real number is 2027, which is the latter half of this decade. And I've said for a long time that that is when the window of vulnerability opens, when China and Russia are ready to strike. So it is important to keep the war in Ukraine up. And despite the corruption in Ukraine, despite that, Ukraine doesn't deserve to live under the continuing Soviets, under the faked demise of Vladimir Putin. It is the continuing Soviets. They are still communist. They're not Christian. And China, though, is the big thing, because Russia can't move without China now. And China's really big. It has 10 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States of America. And it is building ships lickety-split. They're going to have 500 ships by the time they're ready for World War III. An untold number of missiles. The DOD long said that China has 300 nuclear weapons. And I would say, how do you know that? You don't have any inspectors in there. They're just guessing. They have over 300 kilometers of underground nuclear tunnels where they have missiles and nuclear facilities, and nobody knows how many missiles they have. But I'll tell you this, they're making the new DF-41 ICBM, over 100 of those missiles, and they have 10 warheads apiece. That's a lot of warheads. So you know they've got more than 300, and the DOD just increased that estimate to 500. They're still guessing. But at least they're not downplaying China anymore, as they used to say. They realize that China's a threat, and as I have long predicted, when the war gets close, the U.S. government will start to warn you about Russia and China. And they're not going to warn you to have fallout shelters. They're not going to warn you to be prepared, but they're preparing. They have deep underground bunkers, new bunkers, because they know the Russians and Chinese know where their existing bunkers are. Now, the thing that really concerns me is that we don't have the moral integrity and courage anymore, especially since most of the nation continues to send their children to public schools and universities where they get indoctrinated in bad education. They aren't taught about liberty. They aren't taught about the limitations of law. They get induced to experiment with gender dysphoria, transgenderism, and all kinds of worldly things. And sadly, even conservatives send their kids to public schools, most of them. And I'll tell you, you'll rule the day, because I know a lot of conservative families that complain to me about having lost their children, not only to conservatism, but to the church. A lot of them. And it's very sad. And you really have to shield your children from the social influences that abide in this day. And I want to end with this thing, though, before I talk about a little bit of preparedness, because I don't want you to despair that there's no hope. Things are going to get bad, and then they're going to get worse, and we're eventually going to lose our liberty, but not all of us. There'll always be a remnant that will be saved. But if you're prepared, it will help an awful lot. You have to eventually get out of the big cities, or prepare to be out of the big cities, because even if you don't have a nuclear strike within the city, and we do have nuclear targets right here in the Salt Lake area, none here, and even the NSA data center over there in Fort Williams near Lehigh is not a nuclear target. A cruise missile or two will knock that out. And I say more power to them. I'd rather see it knocked out. But it's not a nuclear threat. But there will be fallout from Hill Air Force Base, or from the south, or even from San Diego. Thank you. Even from San Diego or Los Angeles areas, or all the military bases around the United States. So you need to prepare for fallout. But the most important thing you need, bar none, is you need a safe place to hide from. And you may have to hide people from government. If you've ever read the book about Corrie ten Boom, hiding Jews from the Nazis, you may have to hide conservatives from the government, from the NSA, from coming to lock you up like January 6th without any habeas corpus, any fundamental rights whatsoever, because you believe in conspiracy, and you should, because there are real live conspiracies in this world. As the Book of Mormon predicted, as Moroni warned the United States, don't let them overtake you. Well, they have overtaken. It's too late to stop that now. It's happened. It's too big for even Trump to stop. And he can't stop it because he doesn't know who's deep state and who isn't. Even I couldn't stop it, knowing what I know, because they control all of the investigative powers, all the DOJ, and most of the judges. They wouldn't do the eavesdropping necessary to get the data to convict them on. And the judges wouldn't convict even if you got the data. So we're going to go through the tribulation. I know there's some evangelical Christians that believe they're going to get raptured before the tribulation, but I don't buy it. The Lord has always put his people through the meat grinder, just like the pioneers that came to this state, because it makes you grow. We grow soft under prosperity, and that's what's happened to our people. We've gone soft. We bought into a lot of things, and you aren't the people who have bought into the bad things. You have protested. But we need to stand for what is true, and we need to know our conspiratorial history. We need to know about secret combinations, and we have to be very, very careful about what you hear on the internet, because there's a lot of bogus conspiracies out there, which I don't have time to go through. I could speak for another couple of hours, but we don't have that time. But what I want to end on is the fact that you need to have a safe room, a shelter, and preferably, unfortunately, you're in Utah or Idaho, and you have basements in most homes, and the cheapest way to get that is to take a portion of your basement and conceal it so that you can have a place to hide. Because you see, when pillaging starts, and even in Utah, where a lot of people have some preparation, they don't usually have a year's worth of food, and those that don't have the food are going to be pillaging those that do. So you've got to be very careful about what you tell people, how much you have and where. But you've got to have a way of hiding it. And I believe in sharing some, but not all. If you start sharing everything you have, you'll all be starving within 2 weeks, so it doesn't do any good to start to prepare. But I am stockpiling rice. I can give a handful of rice to people. They don't need a wheat grinder. They can boil some rice. So stockpile some rice to share, but don't share your long-term food storage, which you're going to need. But you're going to have to probably be in safe rural places in order to be able to use it and to grow a garden someday. Try growing a garden in a starving situation in a suburban lot, and those tomatoes will be picked clean before they're ripe. But you see, you've got to be able to get out of the way. You don't want to have to confront starving people. You don't want to have to shoot people just because they're starving, even when they get very aggressive. You want to get out of the way, and that's the importance of having a concealed shelter. Andrew and I have written a book called The High Security Shelter. How to do that in a basement. It's a do-it-yourself book, complete architectural plans, and an appendix on where to get all the equipment, etc. And if you have children that are not in safe places, I've written the seminal work, Strategic Relocation, with Andrew, and it's the best-selling work we've ever done. It's still selling very high on Amazon after all these years. First edition was in the year 2000, but it's now with lots of color maps. It covers all of the threats in every state and how you mitigate those threats and where to find the safe places. And I know a lot of your children are, because of jobs, living in big cities, but they need to know how to get back and how to have and find safety with you in rural places, because the cities will become a Mad Max scenario someday. Now, I know you have to stay in the cities sometimes for jobs, but when this strike comes and the electricity goes out, there's no more jobs. You're not coming back to the cities. So make preparations to get rural. And then my other book, as Andrew said, is The Secure Home. That's the first book that I wrote. It's been updated many times. Complete architectural design, construction, and remodeling of self-sufficient residences and high-security retreats. It's a complete Bible on preparedness, not just construction. But it does tell you how to do new construction of shelters and how to place them in a remodeling situation, how to hide them, how to get the equipment, how to do, if you need to, bulletproof walls, windows, and doors. I developed gravel wall construction for those that don't have bulletproof construction. You can put gravel in the walls of a master bedroom closet and turn it into a safe room. Lots of great ideas in there. All of these books are highly discounted to you in the back. If after this you want to buy some of these, we only can take, because of no credit cards here, we can only take cash or check, and so, but we invite you to do that. And I have one little book, a great storage and barter book, 10 Packs for Survival, a list of all the items, or a lot of the items, a good basic starting list for what to store in 10 basic areas, and that's only $2. But I want to end by telling you that I need to explain a very important emotional, spiritual, or psychological aspect. I've talked to this group before, every year, a little bit about the workings of conscience and how you need to be very good at listening to conscience and to be able to survive what's coming, both to hear the warnings and to hear the promptings of how to change and how to prepare and how to do it the right way. And I've taught everybody the principle that the interesting thing about conscience is it sounds like you talking to yourself. But if you're careful, you can understand there's two other voices trying to talk to you. One is the divine source, giving you promptings and warnings and trying to get you to overcome your weaknesses. And you're resistant to that voice because you're resistant to overcoming your weaknesses. And I've talked about weight control and how that's a real problem within our movement. But the other voice, the Satan voice, a lot of people don't understand. They think that if Satan's talking, I'm going to feel some dark, brooding force. And that's only true if you listen to it for a long time and you get really involved, but it isn't normally true. Satan, I want to tell you, is forever camped on your shoulder, and he's ready to give you any excuse to counter what the Lord is trying to get you to do. Get up on time? Oh no, you could sleep in a little longer. It's not a dark feeling, it's a comfortable feeling. It's telling you what you want to hear. That's Satan. And you need to be sensitive to that. You need to teach your children that when they get the prompting from the Lord to do their homework and they get that little feeling, oh no, you can do it later, go play with your friends. That's Satan talking. Now it sounds like them talking themselves, but that's how constant Satan is working on you. I don't care how good you are. He's always there looking for any opening to weaken you, to divert you from doing your best. And remember, you're naturally resistant to the changes the Lord wants you to make because those are innate. You came from the pre-existence with weaknesses. They weren't gifts of God. You developed them there. You saw what was going on in earth life. You said, ooh, I want to do that when I get there. Ooh, I want to do that. And that's why all of your children, you see, have different, and the modern children coming here have real problems. They're really oriented towards worldly things. And you've got to be able to teach your children how to observe and understand their weaknesses and put a little pressure on them to overcome them. That's why I believe in some physical discipline. But you see, this battle within your own soul about listening to conscience is where the real battle of life is. It's not in the commandments. The commandment is just to get you in the ballpark where you're supposed to listen to the individual voice that's really guiding and giving you the individual instruction. And that's the secret to life. And I witness to you that that's how you're going to really survive. But I'll tell you, 90% of the promptings you'll get from conscience are temporal. They're temporal. They're about eating habits. They're about TV habits. They're about overweight. They're about lack of exercise. They're about disciplining your children. And you don't recognize those. That's why I don't talk to people about listening to the Spirit, because they always think, well, that's about spiritual things. No. I talk about conscience because it's about temporal things mostly. And why? The Lord is testing your ability to overcome the temporal. So then you can get the higher spiritual knowledge. And you won't get the higher, no matter, now that doesn't say you haven't gotten some spiritual impressions, but you don't know what you've missed until you abide by the temporal promises. And then the Lord really opens up the windows of heaven and you start to get real information. I work all week long trying to sort out truth from error, and I have to be very careful to develop a sensitive conscience to know and distinguish truth from error. And that's part of the secret of life. But I don't want you to despair. There is hope, and if you learn to listen to conscience, He will guide you. He will impress upon you how to prepare, how to sacrifice to get that preparation done, and you will prepare it, and you will feel warning voices that you won't be surprised when this war comes. I thank you for the time to be able to speak to you. I wish you the best. I feel a great camaraderie with you, and thank you very much.